A young woman was last seen in her backyard talking to somebody with camo on, and then she would disappear. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts to never miss video upload. Let's get started. Holly Bobo was just like any 20-something-year-old living in Tennessee with her family. She was studying nursing at the University of Tennessee. Holly could be described as beautiful and kind and caring and just fun. But that would all change on April 13th, 2011. On that morning, Holly's mother, Karen, got a distressing call while she was at work. One of the family's neighbors made a call to Karen and said, "You know, I hear screaming and it's coming from the direction of your house." Karen had only left the house 20 minutes ago, and when she left, everything was fine. Holly had been studying for an exam, and her brother, Clint, who was 25, was sleeping still. And her husband had already left for work, so nothing was out of the norm. But this call really terrified Karen. So Karen thanked the neighbor, she hung up, and then she called the house phone. And Clint picked up. And obviously Karen is like, "Hey, the neighbors called, they heard something. Where is Holly?" Clint would look out the window and he'd say, "Well, her car is still here." And from that moment on, Karen grew frantic. She said Holly should have already gone to school. And she hung up and she dialed 911 immediately. So Clint had actually been woken just moments before his mother called because he heard dogs barking. So Clint hangs up the phone, he gets up, he goes to the kitchen, and he peers out a window. And there's Holly in the yard talking to some man who's wearing all camouflage. But this didn't seem strange because Holly's boyfriend was a hunter and he had planned on hunting that day. The thing is, Drew Scott, Holly's boyfriend, had planned on hunting that day, but he wouldn't be hunting at Holly Bobo's house. And he'd actually called both Holly and Karen that morning to double check that he had permission to be hunting on Karen's mother's property. Unfortunately, Clint didn't know this. So obviously Karen had hung up and she's trying to call the police, but she's not getting through to the right authorities. So she gets frustrated, she hangs up and she calls Clint back. And Clint says, "Hey, don't worry, Holly's outside, I can see her and it looks like she's with Drew." Karen would say, "That's not Drew. Get a gun and shoot him." And Clint is like, "What are you talking about? I'm not gonna shoot a stranger. What is wrong with you?" So instead he actually tried to call Holly and then he tried to call her boyfriend Drew, but nobody was answering. And then at one point he watched Holly and the man disappear into the woods. And at that point, he did go and grab his loaded pistol and ran outside. Unfortunately, when he got there, he saw a puddle of blood next to Holly's car. And still, Clint is confused. He figured, okay, maybe Drew had gotten a turkey and he brought it here, which would explain the blood, and he just wanted to show Holly before she went to school. But there was no turkey and there was no Holly. Only a few minutes later, a patrol car did arrive at Holly's home, and the search for her began. And now that the search has begun, hundreds of people are volunteering and they're combing the woods looking for Holly. And when you think about it, there's such a short time frame here. Clint notices she goes into the woods with this man. He runs outside, he notices blood. The police officer arrives on scene and they immediately begin the search, but they wouldn't find Holly. So hundreds of concerned citizens volunteered to search, and everybody was on horseback and ATVs, and they were just combing the woods for Holly. On April 15th, Holly Bobo's lunchbox would be found, and it wasn't far from the family home. And that's not the only thing searchers would find. They found a pair of women's underwear that were pink and a wadded up piece of paper with Holly's name on it. Unfortunately, after that, nobody knows what happened to Holly Bobo. So what everybody knew for sure is that Holly Bobo was getting up, she was getting ready, and she was going to school that day. And she went outside, she talked to a man in camouflage that was not her boyfriend, and then she disappeared. She was literally abducted from her own yard. Investigators really didn't have any leads, but they would investigate a man known as Terry Britt, who was a local sex offender, and he lived near the Bobo's home.
He is a horrible, horrible human being. He spent the majority of his life in prison for kidnapping and rape. And he absolutely perfectly matches the description that Clint Bobo provided of Holly's abductor. His entire alibi was a lie. The cadaver dogs alerted to 2 of Britt's vehicles and several tools around his house. Somebody has been decomposing in or around these vehicles and around these tools.
So you seized the vehicles and the tools and tested them for any DNA?
Correct.
No DNA?
Correct.
A recording of a chilling conversation he had with Britt. Britt seems to actually fantasize about what Holly's kidnapper might have been thinking.
She's young, pretty, perfect, somewhat body.
Yeah.
Okay. like a toy. He can't wait to get her to wherever he's going to take her to because he's wanting that body. But here comes reality. Now I've got a body. What am I going to do with it? If you keep it, you got to feed it. You got to hide it. And if you kill it, what are you going to do with it?
And apparently his home was searched, he was interviewed extensively, but they had nothing on him, so they had to let him go. But then, almost 3 years later, they had suspects. And these suspects were a pair of brothers, Zach and Dylan Adams. Zach and Dylan weren't new to the investigation. They had actually been considered early on in the investigation, along with a pair of cousins, one named Shane Austin and Jason Autry. Apparently, next to Shane Austin's trailer, Holly Bobo's underwear had been found. So apparently Dylan Adams would be arrested for an unrelated charge. He had a weapons charge. And obviously while he was being arrested, they realized now's the time to question him. And to their surprise, Dylan had a lot to say. He would say that on April 13th, 2011, the day that Holly went missing, he'd went to his brother Zach's home and saw something incredibly disturbing. He would tell the police officers that when he arrived at his brother's home, he saw that Holly was sitting in a chair and all she had on was a pink t-shirt. He would say that his brother Zach was wearing camouflage shorts and he had videotaped raping Holly. On March 5th, 2014, Zach Adams was indicted for murder and kidnapping, and the same charges were filed against Jason Autry on April 29th. And apparently while they were searching for Zach Adams' video, they actually came across two more suspects, which were two brothers named Jeff and Mark Percy. And apparently Jeff's former roommate had claimed to see part of that video that Zach made. Jeff's former roommate, Sandra King, would say that, "I seen a woman that was tied up that was crying. She was blonde. It looked like Holly Bobo." And apparently while Zach Adams was in jail, he told an inmate that if his brother didn't keep quiet, he would put Dylan in a hole beside her. And apparently beside her meant Holly. Apparently he would also say, "I'm not worried because they got no body and they got no gun." And of course, many people at this point believed that Holly was dead. Nobody knew how or where she was. Somehow with Dylan's confession, it implicated Shane Austin. And apparently when the cops questioned Shane Austin, he agreed to lead them to the body of Holly, but he said that he wanted immunity from charges. So he would lead them to a plot of land, but they couldn't find Holly's remains. And when prosecutors tried to revoke his immunity, Shane Austin would actually kill himself in a hotel room in Florida. On September 18th, 2014, hunters would actually come across Holly Bobo's remains, and her remains were actually in a bucket. They did find Holly's skull, and apparently there was a gunshot wound to the skull. So it wouldn't be until 2017 when the trial began. And apparently Jason Autry, who was friends with Zach, turned on his friend during testimony. He was actually a key witness in the case against Zach.
Autry said he was pulled into the crime when he went to see Zach Adams to buy drugs. It was the morning that Holly Bobo went missing.
The body was laying in a multicolored farm blanket.
Without a shovel or a pickaxe to bury her body, Autry suggested disemboweling the body and dumping it into the water under Interstate 40. Autry testified that when he started to pull Bobo's body from Adams' truck, he heard a noise and saw a foot move.
This still alive.
Autry said Adams then shot Bobo in the head, but the two were spooked by a nearby boater and took off with Bobo's body still in the truck. 2 days later, Autry said he found out Adams had dumped Bobo's body in Benton County.
You didn't have to kill her. And Zach told him, said, "You're just as damn guilty. You hit him." And Zach told him, said, "You shut your fucking mouth."
Though, if you remember, a ginseng hunter found her remains in a neighboring county, Decatur County.
Of course, Jason Autry said that he had nothing to do with it. All he did was help hide the body. He would say that he didn't have anything to do with hurting her. So apparently Dylan Adams, who was Zach Adams' brother and made this original confession, had a below average IQ and had a learning disability. And apparently his mother said that neither of her sons had the intelligence to plot a kidnapping and murder. So the defense obviously said that the police coerced a confession out of Dylan, and because he had a lower IQ and a learning disability, they were obviously successful. Eventually, Zach Adams was sentenced to life in prison. And then the following year, his brother, Dylan Adams, actually entered an Alford plea. So an Alford plea is basically when a defendant maintains their innocence and they won't admit to the criminal act they've been accused of, but they admit that the prosecution has enough evidence, basically to persuade a judge and jury that this person is in fact guilty. So he would receive 15 years for murder and 35 years for aggravated kidnapping. And the charges against the Percy brothers were eventually dropped. Jason Autry would eventually plead guilty to solicitation to commit murder and facilitation to aggravated kidnapping. He would get a reduced sentence and was actually released from prison in September of 2020. The case is interesting because 6 men were implicated in the murder of this woman and 3 were eventually charged. And it was based off the confession of Dylan Adams, who had an intellectual disability and a lower IQ. And it doesn't seem like anybody really knows why he was targeted as a suspect in the first place. And of course, everybody wonders what actually happened. Did Jason have more to do with this? Is Zach the right person? It just seemed like there was a lot of evidence missing. Jason would actually be arrested again after he was released for drug and firearm possession and evading arrest. So obviously Jason is a bit of a shady character. He seems to always be up to no good. And from my understanding, there's very little forensic evidence connecting any of these suspects to the crime. So I question if he would have ever been convicted if there was no testimony against him. If his brother hadn't said something, if Jason hadn't said something, would he have been convicted of this crime? It very much seems all circumstantial. I could be wrong, but from my research, it doesn't seem like there's a lot connecting him to this crime. So I'd love to know your guys' thoughts on it. So pop in the comments below. Let me know if I'm missing something, because it just seems like this case is really messy and there's just not a lot there. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments below and I'll get to as many of them as possible. See you next time.